Hello everybody, I am Let's Go. So I have to preface this with that I have played BioShock Infinite and the other BioShock games for that matter. I just have an opinion that I'd like to express as a player of BioShock Infinite and as an enjoyer of the other two BioShock games. I do not mind if you enjoy the game and all the power to you, so please be respectful to me and everyone else who might share the same opinion as me. Also, I'd like to add that this isn't a researched essay, just an essay based off of my experiences with the game. Furthermore, I could be wrong about some things, and constructive criticism would be appreciated. Now on to the video! So the gameplay does differ from the other BioShock games, but I wouldn't say it does so in a good way. Let me explain why. So let's start with a minor complaint that I have that isn't really that bad of a change, it just personally bothers me, which would be how they switched the jump button. It was a weird thing to get used to after playing the first two, but not the biggest offender. The biggest offender is how they made the game feel like a generic shooter, which the first two were anything but. Why do I bring it up? Because the game's other mechanic suffers for it. Now let's talk about the plasmids, or vigors. I dislike how they underutilized the vigors, but that's probably due to how they made the game feel like a generic shooter. I never felt the need to use my vigors since I always had a gun on me, which could do enough damage. In the first two games, especially the second, you would always utilize both your plasmids and the weapons you've got, but in Infinite, it feels useless too. Another thing, why is the 2-weapon limit there? It feels so limiting. The first two had, what, an 8-weapon limit? Don't quote me on that, I could be wrong, but the 2-weapon limit would make the player feel cramped, especially after the first two. Also, why is ammo so hard to come by? It makes the game harder, which would work, but it doesn't work here. The first two would have ammo you could find and or buy. Also, the game's upgrade system to upgrade weapons and vigors is so expensive. I'll be honest, I never used it because I never had or found enough money. With the first two games, I always had a few upgrades because they were easy to get. Also, Elizabeth is overpowered and yet not used as good as she could be. She makes these portal thingies. I will get into why I dislike her powers later, promise. You get almost everything you need through her, and they did limit it, which is a good way to make things difficult. There's also how you don't have to defend Elizabeth, a great thing to be sure, don't need an escort mission the entire game, but I would have loved to see Elizabeth on par with the player or Booker. Make her someone who isn't afraid to shoot people if you're close to death. That'd be so much more fun. Here's something that fits in both this category and the story category, which is how our choices don't matter. Don't give me the "your choices don't matter" bullshit. This game goes over the multiverse, which, yes, I have issues with too, just wait, relies on our choices and their different outcomes. Before you say anything about the game acknowledging our choices, that's not enough. It would have been fun to see branching endings based on the choices. Now that I've stated what bothered me about the gameplay, how would I rework it to be good? I'd start by making it play similar to BioShock 2 since that game was peak gameplay. I'd make the vigor and weapon upgrades cheaper along with making money and ammo easier to find. I'd honestly remove Elizabeth's powers. You'll see why in the story category, don't worry. I'd also make so that the choices you make are actually important to the plot and or gameplay. Now that we finished that section, let's go on to the next. BioShock Infinite's story is honestly just not as good as it could have been. The characters aren't that interesting to me, and I personally prefer Rapture over Columbia any day. Compared to the previous two games, BioShock Infinite is absolutely confusing. The characters aren't as interesting as the previous two games' characters, and the setting is pretty, but I genuinely prefer Rapture. Let me explain. Before I get into the plot, believe me, I have serious issues with it. Let me explain why I dislike the characters. Booker isn't that interesting of a main character, I'm sorry. Look, I get some may not have been a fan of the first two protagonists due to them being silent. I, however, enjoy silent protagonists. Maybe I'll make an essay over that too. But getting back on topic, Booker being voiced was a surprise. Also, the man's so fucking dumb. Like, he was told not to pick number 77 by, I assume, the person or people he has to pay back by essentially kidnapping Elizabeth and taking her to New York, but he does anyway. Before that, or maybe a bit after that, I don't remember, he sees a sign speaking about the false shepherd which shows a clawed hand with AD on it, which, you know, he has. He didn't even think to cover it. I dislike Booker. If he wasn't a dumbass, I might have liked him, honestly, but he is. Now on to Elizabeth. Look, man, I hate her. Not as badly as Booker, but she irks me. She runs off after you kill a few guys, which would spawn regardless of if you threaten the guy on the phone or not. Yes, I have personal issue with her running, but I also have personal issue with your choice not mattering. Can you tell I like for choices to have an effect if they're offered? Look, they could have just not given us choices and I wouldn't be here complaining. but they did. You can't pull the excuse of how it's the multiverse since, again, the multiverse relies on the multiple choices we make. How would I have made the scene where Elizabeth runs off? I would have made it so that if you threatened the dude, no enemies would spawn, which would make Elizabeth think of Booker as a violent man. However, if you don't threaten the man, enemies will spawn since he'll snitch on you. You might think it's counterintuitive, but respectfully, it would work, no? The average gamer, myself included, would assume he's snitching and thus threaten him. If people assume the best, they'd get betrayed too. Or just make a random chance per option? Sorry, I just hate that scene so much. Also, I disliked Elizabeth running off since you defended her. It doesn't make sense to me as to why she'd run off. I'll be honest, the other characters are forgettable. They aren't like the first two games' characters and how you could probably remember most or just a select few. You might be asking why I don't like Columbia. Let me explain. Unlike Rapture, it doesn't feel fleshed out and just feels like it's a city in the sky. I think what made Rapture so fleshed out is the obvious lore, but it's also due to how you're encouraged to explore. I think that's partly why I don't like the navigation aid as much. However, the first two also had something similar, so I'll let it slide. Now we have to go on to the plot. This will be rough. So our protag is Booker DeWitt, and the reason he first visits Columbia is because he has a debt to be paid off, which includes essentially kidnapping a girl. He acts like a dumbass, which gets him noticed, and thus he's targeted by Comstock, the main antagonist of the game. Considering the religious influence on the setting, I get why Comstock is considered so important, but I would have loved to see how truly fucked up he could be to the people. Anyways, back to the plot. You eventually find Elizabeth and she joins you. You lie to her about your intentions, dumbass, which eventually leads to her running away from you after the first running off. You get her back and all that shit. You eventually meet the Vox Populi, who are folk revolting against Comstock, last that I remember. I liked them. They were interesting. Too bad they weren't the main protags. Anyways, the story goes on, and Elizabeth gets kidnapped by Songbird, this giant robotic bird. Also, you learn, either before or after Elizabeth is kidnapped, that Booker is actually Elizabeth's father, and that Elizabeth and Booker are from a different universe. I wasn't really surprised to learn that Booker was her father since I, as the player, had built-in fatherly instincts towards her due to, BioShock being a dad simulator series. Anyways, you have to venture to rescue her. You get a time travel type beat and see the future of the world, or at least New York, in an older version of Elizabeth. You head back in time and save Elizabeth. The plot goes on until the ending. Oh, the ending. It infuriates me. Beforehand, you realize that Booker and Comstock are the same person. So several versions of Elizabeth begin arguing whether you are Comstock or Booker before Booker says he's both. They drown Booker, and for whatever reason, all of the Elizabeths fade away. That's not how the multiverse works, game. That Booker would be dead, but not every version of him would die. I think the main things that made the story not work for me was how Elizabeth's powers time travel to some extent, and the multiverse was added with no knowledge on how they work, along with how they were never set up in previous games. So it was extremely jarring to see here. So how would I rework the plot, setting, and character? So the obvious is to get rid of the multiverse, Elizabeth's powers, and the time travel. They aren't needed and in fact make things confusing. I'd also make there be less characters so the few we have are memorable. Also, I'd make the setting more interesting by making it so exploration is more rewarding to do, and adding small bits of lore which aren't necessary for the player to find, but they give more context for the world. So I have two ideas for the plot rework. The first makes it so Columbia was made by a child or descendant of Eleanor from the second game. Why would a child or descendant attempt to capture the essence of Rapture but in the sky? 2 words. Human hubris. Like me, her kid or descendant could look at something and think they could do it better. But they end up failing, but it's different to how Rapture failed. Instead of falling into physical ruins, it falls into a societal ruin. Not as bad as Rapture, but due to how the upper classes ignore the lower class, the lower class would develop a plague-type virus which slowly kills the person with it, but infects them to the point of losing their humanity before dying, which would make them interesting enemies. I make Booker someone trying to protect his daughter from the plague as he tries to find a cure. Yes, similar to The Last of Us, but due to plasmids, I feel it'd be fun to play through. The second option takes a different approach. It keeps base game's religion and how its setting is, along with keeping the plague virus as described for the other option. Before I explain more, I'd like to talk about what the first 2 games aim to go for. The first game aims to go for the brain, messing with your sense of control and logic. The second game game aims, I'd argue aims for the heart, try and mess with your sense of paternal instincts, like the first game does too, and your sense of justice along with the physiological to some extent due to how Delta's life is depending on how close he is to Eleanor. I think that's another issue I have with Infinite. It doesn't really go for anything. You could argue it goes for religion, but it's not really a main point in the game. To some extent, I can see messing with your paternal instincts, but that's obvious with the BioShock games due to the little sisters, Eleanor and Elizabeth. Don't bring up how it messes with your sense of logic, because the way it did mess with my sense of peace and tranquility. Anyways, back to my second rewrite. You know how I said keep the base game religion? Another thing, it's bringing back Comstock, but he's a completely different person from Booker. Speaking of Booker, let me explain how the plague virus works in this rewrite. So instead of it being an already existing virus that transfers from person to person, it was specifically created to be a punishment, and Booker was the lucky lab rat. The virus still works how I described it. It slowly kills the person as it slowly takes away their humanity. How is Booker still alive? They found a way to freeze it at the point in time of where he's at his prime of having no humanity, but renders him not killable through the virus. The punishment is making someone lose their humanity and wander the world as a husk, a wild beast only for humans to hunt and kill them like animals. So Booker is patient zero, a test subject if you will. But why was he chosen? Well, his parents died of tragic events and his wife died during childbirth, making him the perfect test subject since there would be none missing him, all except for a child which Comstock would take to raise as his own. Booker would have been experimented on for many years, being away from his daughter for many years, and eventually going into an amnesiac state as he becomes a monster, which leads to Comstock making Booker have his own version of the "would you kindly" phrase. I imagine they'd also have experimented with Booker more by adding what Delta has with Eleanor, but with Booker it genuinely hurts if he's away from Elizabeth for too long. By away, I mean if he's not in close proximity to her. The game would start up with a first-person cutscene that helps set up how much pain Booker is in. Booker eventually breaks out of the laboratory he's stuck in and is stuck in the world of Columbia. Due to Booker escaping, Comstock would make the signs warning folk of the false shepherd since he didn't want to cause fear about an experiment of his that was kept under wraps. Now here's where the gameplay differs. As Booker, there's two ways you'd be able to play the game. Stealth is one way, which would lead to the good ending. What's the catch? You're hit more easily and take damage much harder. However, your plasmids, or vigors, do more damage. I'll explain the other gameplay and why using stealth makes your gameplay harder. As Booker in this rewrite, you can only use plasmids/vigors. Before you call out how I was complaining about the 2-weapon limit, let me explain. In this rewrite, Booker has been reduced to a wild animal, driven by instinct, so I doubt he'd be able to pick up a gun and realize how it works. In exchange for a lack of guns, the two gameplays offer a different option based on your gameplay. The stealth gameplay lets you dual wield plasmids/vigors. The monstrous, which is the other gameplay, lets you control the infected. Now let me explain the other gameplay. The other gameplay lets you go all out, even using melee. Since you don't stealth through the game, you become stronger, faster, and more bullet resilient. You also get aid from the people you infect with the virus via a bite, or you can kill folk to heal your health. Stealth gets health via plants which are easy to find. In the monstrous gameplay, if you infect someone, they become your companion and infect others until they die. The gameplay also differs in how enemies are to you. The stealth has easier enemies if you decide to go the monstrous route eventually. However, if you start off monstrous, the enemies start off hard and are always on high alert. Now the game will eventually have Elizabeth meeting you as you eventually find her and break her out. In both, she's apprehensive of you at first since you kind of look non-human. So by non-human, that can either be Booker looking like he's rotting and or, like the murder of Crow's vigor, affects the entire body and is permanent. This is the middle of the game. Depending on if you are playing the monstrous or stealth route, determines how many times Elizabeth runs from you. If she does run from you, you have to get her back. If you played stealth, Elizabeth would protect your back and shoot folk back for you. Eventually, Comstock kidnaps Elizabeth and you have to go rescue her again if you did the monstrous route, or for the first time if you did the stealth route. The end of the game either has you killing Comstock in an animalistic manner, which causes Elizabeth to shoot you dead for the monstrous route, and for the stealth route, you're weakly fighting against Comstock until Elizabeth kills him before she patches you up. Where does the "would you kindly" phrase come into place? There would be a new mechanic, which would be you fighting against the phrase where it starts off hard and grows easier over time. If beating, you get a random buff. If failed, you don't get a buff. However, said random buffs always make you stronger no matter the buff. Anyways, that was how I'd rewrite the plot. On to the next. I'll be honest, I've never played the DLC. It could be fun for all I know, but I've never played it. However, it's supposed to add on to the BioShock lore, which I take issue with. If the info given in the DLC is important to the game's lore and helps explain how the base game fits into the other games, why not put it into the base game? Like, I shouldn't have to get the DLC to understand the game or how it connects to the other games. That's my main issue with the DLC. Since the previous two games' DLCs weren't things needed to understand the setting or the story. They just added neat details that are cool to know or just fun little challenges. So that's the end of the video. Again, if I was wrong about anything, please respectfully correct me. Anyway, see y'all whenever I come back with the milk.